I want to welcome you to a side event which is called How Can Climate Action Advance Peace, Human Well-Being and Safety? And it is co-hosted by Soka Gakkai International, Quakers in Britain, Brahma Kumaris, Quaker Earth Care Witness, and the Quaker United Nations in Geneva. And I've asked you to sit close because I'm going to ask you to talk to each other in a minute. This is a dialogue as much as we can make it. We want to be a little radical in the UNFCCC space. We almost wanted to put the chairs here, but they wouldn't let us because it's live streaming. So we are going to film this event for our outreach. Could you raise your hand if you don't want to be filmed? Okay. Then a brief introduction to frame this. When we came together to put together a side event, we said, how do we do a side event at a time when our societies experience rising fear and anxiety over climate change and related planetary crises, when there is rising intolerance and suffering in our communities, when there are crimes against humanity that our leaders ignore, when war is spreading and more money is given to military and we're told there's less money for climate, for health, for education, and to eradicate poverty. What is this world when some of our leaders are saying that military spending will bring greater safety, but what does more suffering, destruction, and loss of life, how does that bring greater safety to us? And so what is real safety? And that's what we're here to talk about today. When global warming and biodiversity collapse and related planetary crises are in fact existential crises on our way of living and existence on this earth. And if transforming root causes driving planetary crises can help to advance peace, well-being, and safety, how do we do that? And how do we have the decisions that our leaders are making so that this can actually lead toward more just and fair societies? So in this hour, we ask, how can climate action advance peace, human well-being, and safety? I'm going to ask you to take a deep breath. We talk about a moment of silence. I'm just going to say, center down for a moment. Rushing spaces. Here comes Elisa, who's the UN Special Rapporteur and is always rushing. Open. Can someone open the door? Yeah. Elisa, do come.
Maybe it's a minute of silence. Let's try to remove the glass. That's what's up now. Okay. Sorry about that.
Come soon. So in that centering down, I would like you to turn to someone, left, right, wherever it is. And I want you to spend a few minutes talking to them or in a little group. And here is a question to talk to each other about. We meet at a time of these deepening planetary crises and intensified war and suffering. What does human well-being and safety mean to me? What gives me a sense of personal security in these troubled times? Turn to your neighbor and share. Can I draw you back again? Thank you. That was fantastic. We're going to do this again in the next hour. I just want to share the sort of structure for the next hour and a bit. We're going to first hear from our 5 voices, panelists, but actually they are shared voices here in this room. And they will each speak for just about 5 minutes. And they're going to speak not only from their professional experience, but also from their heart and their spiritual connection. This is a space of connecting both what we do and why we do, and how we see climate action helping with peace. So once they've had a chance to speak, we're going to open back up to everyone talking to each other on what heard briefly, and then I want you to share. I want you to share with us, what did you hear? What struck you? What do you want to bring into that dialogue? And then we'll end with a moment's silence. So I'm first going to bring us to Flore, Ghetti, And Flore is with the Buddhist organization Soka Gakkai International. Flore is also very involved in the human rights and anti-militarism group, and in bringing that voice, we're going to start looking at the military. Flore.
Thank you so much, and hello everyone. A pleasure to see that this topic of peace and climate action attracts a lot of people, and I did n'importe quoi with it's fine. So I wanted to speak a little bit about the aspect of militarism and climate change, and how militarism is actually a major driver of climate change, be it because of the emissions, of the resource depletion that it causes, because of the ecological damage that it causes. And so when we look a little bit deeper into it, we realize that one thing that is studied quite a lot is the impact of climate change on security. And one thing that is not studied so much is the impact of militarization on actually climate and the environment. And why that? Well, one aspect that is just a little bit technical is that countries are not obliged to report on the emissions that they generate from the military's activity under the UNFCCC. So that constitutes a kind of transparency and accountability gap. Because for the context, for the 1997 Kyoto Protocol, there was some pressure from the US to just keep out military emission from this protocol, and then the Paris Agreement, the 2015 Paris Agreement, just made military emissions voluntary. So states are not, they just don't have to do it. So we don't really know what they do. So that's one aspect. And so the result today is that we have few parties that report, and when they report, the data is not really completely there, or it's completely absent. But we still have some centers and some experts that are trying to analyze the data that they have, and from what they could draw as a conclusion is that the military, the estimate of the impact of the military is 5.5% of the global emissions. So the military carbon footprint would equal to 5.5% of the global of the total emissions, which is quite a lot, I think. And that gives us a kind of figure or image that maybe would talk to us a little bit more, is that if we combine all the militaries in the world, and we say that the militaries are a country, they would be the fourth highest emitter. After you have China, the US, India, and right after you have the military, which is again quite enormous, because it would be, in the end, it would be just larger than the total emission of shipping, and larger than the third one, that is the civilian aviation, because shipping is 3% and civilian aviation is 2%. So that says a lot about how much, and that's just estimate. It could be, it's likely higher than that and far worse. And so when we look into militarism, we have some theories that come from the environmental sociology that talks about the treadmill of destruction. Sorry, I'm sorry that the mood will lighten after me. I'm just setting a scene that it's a bit worrying, but there will be hope at the end of this event, I promise. So when we look into the treadmill of destruction, it explains that basically there's this geopolitical competition that we're in with this modern militarism that we are living, that creates this kind of expansionary, self-perpetuating cycle that drives environmental damage. And so when we study a bit militarism, we start seeing that it just creates feedback loops of certain things. So when we look about the military-industrial complex, there's a feedback loop creating, because one aspect is that there's a use of military power to secure resources, and then there's the consumption of the resources that we have secured, and then the profit that comes from the consumption of those resources is reinvesting to have higher military capabilities that will serve to extract more resources that will make more consumption and that will again create more profit. And so that's, in French we say that the snake that bites its own tail, and it's never ending. And actually, while doing a little bit of research on this infinite feedback loop and on this consumption of those energies that are mainly fossil fuels, I came across the information that the largest institutional consumer of fossil fuel is the Pentagon. I thought you might be interested in knowing that one. And so if we look to another feedback loop, that's the one that is interesting for us also because it's regarding climate change. It's the climate security nexus. And you realize that as climate impact intensifies, government perceive that as growing instability, so it spends more resources strengthening the military, which makes climate change worse, which makes insecurity worse, which makes government grow into more militarization. And again, we go into a cycle that never ends, and that does not create peace, and that does not create security, or at least that does not create the sense of security that maybe as individual we would like to have. Maybe national governments or other bigger institutions see security as something else. Maybe there would be a need to redefine the notion of security and what it means. So that's just climate disruption drives more military, drives more disruption, drives more military. And one thing that is worth mentioning, or I don't have anymore, is that, so one aspect when we look also into the military side of things is that, of course, military conflicts have enormous environmental impact, and it's not just about like increasing military expenditure. It's not about just the spendings or just the emissions. It's about also sometimes environmental degradation is just a tool of war. It's just a way of annihilating an entire population. It's just not the people that we kill, but it's just how we just erase how they live and how they could survive and the environment around. And we see it with the genocide in Palestine that also became an ecocide because of the polluted water basins, the white phosphorus, the eradication of vegetation. So we have a whole destruction of the environment that can be a strategy of war, and that has also enormous impact of climate change. And so all of that, and the last aspect, and I come to how can we change things, is that you need money for that, and the money that is used in the military spendings is just completely like redirect, how can I say, this redirects public funding that could be used for something else. So if you spend more money in the military, it means you spend less money in education, less money in climate action, less money in health services. And so that's what that comes to the last point, is that what do we ask to the UNFCCC and what we can do? And there would be two aspects. One is we need accountability and transparency on the emissions reporting. We need to know, states need to be accountable on their military emissions. And then we need a shift from public spending for the military to spending for climate finance, for climate action. There was I will finish on that figure, is if we just took 15% of the military spending and we reinvested in climate finance, it would solve probably adaptation for the most vulnerable countries or even mitigation. So there's this need to really ask for accountability and to push for this redirection of funding and resources to aspect that would drive more peace, in my sense. Thank you.
Thank you, Flore. I'm going to now move to Elisa, having had a very strong framing on what we're seeing around us and possibly in our countries in war and military spending and destruction. I'm now going to Elisa Morgera, who is a professor at Durham University and is the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Climate Change and Human Rights, We framed a question for Elisa, which I'll read briefly. We often talk about climate action as inherently good, but for some communities, climate projects have brought harm, dispossession, not safety. How do we ensure that action doesn't become a new form of harm? Thank you, Elisa.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. It's really such an important conversation we're having. And maybe just to say, in my role as Special Rapporteur, it's not working. Oh, did I have to do both? Yes. Okay, sorry. This is a good demonstration. In my role as Special Rapporteur, the learning curve has been so incredible and never stopping. And particularly, I think this understanding of climate action potentially or actually being harmful, but also the connection with armed conflicts and militarism. It's not something that I was expecting to be so aware of and thinking and learning so much from Flore and many other colleagues around the world, but particularly from the human rights holders who not only find themselves at the front lines of climate change, but also at the front lines of the negative impacts of certain climate measures. And it's important to understand that this may appear as isolated experiences, isolated elements of reality, but what I understood more and more is how these experiences, many sometimes very localized experiences, point us to a deeper understanding of the interrelations among the injustices that explain why we're in a climate crisis and why we're stuck sometimes in reinforcing harmful processes. So some of the very first experiences of harm from climate measures came from many indigenous peoples and environmental human rights defenders I've met at the very beginning of my mandate about this very rushed expansion of critical minerals, often combined with further expansion of fossil fuel operations in some very paradoxical ways, looking at expansion of sacrifice zones, where we would have more coal-fired power plants to process minerals, even to recycle them, which we would hope will be a way to extract less. And so often those harmful activities on indigenous territories or the territories of traditional farmers, rural women, small-scale fishers, all people that finally Western science have recognized have better knowledge systems in understanding the interconnectedness of our life-supporting systems and the interconnectedness of how we can take effective action to protect the climate system and protect human rights. So there's a double form of harm on top of many generations of harm that these same communities have faced, because we're not only violating their rights once again in the name of climate action, but we're also destroying even more their knowledge and practices that are, to be honest, one of the biggest areas of hope that we should all hold on to really hope for climate action to be redirected in ways that are protective of the climate system as part of life-supporting systems. So that's a first layer. Unfortunately, it's a very well-known pattern of human rights violations of indigenous peoples and peasants. But again, in understanding that, we often think, well, what we need to do, we know what we need to do. We know what we need to prevent those human rights violations that unfortunately are very familiar patterns. And often we end up thinking, well, this is a matter of safeguards. Let's improve our protocols, understanding better what FPIC, free, prior, informed consent means, how we do better environmental impact assessments, etc. Now, this is true, but only in part. Partly because it puts this on the side. It assumes that the direction of travel is correct. We just need to do it better. And this is still quite hard to do in principle and in practice. But I think what I was thinking more and more in conversation with those human rights holders and knowledge holders, they're all saying, but why is this happening? Why does this keep happening? And that, I think, points to a deeper reason why we see that we're on a wrong track to save the climate. We think, many people, particularly in the global north, think, we need those minerals at all costs because that's what's going to save us all from more climate harm. But in fact, we need to look at the economic interests, the economic actors who are pushing for quick access to minerals much faster and without taking into account, for instance, projection of technological developments, which may already tomorrow, in 6 months, not require the same minerals or not in the same quantities or not in the same timelines. And so it was interesting how deeper I was like, okay, so who are those economic interests? Who's behind critical minerals? Well, one obvious sector is electric vehicles. We know that car manufacturers have been best friends with fossil fuels for a very long time. What are electric vehicles made of? Plastics, to be lighter. What's plastics made of? Fossil fuels. So, little by little, are we really moving away from fossil fuels by just thinking that we're doing fast, quick, no, usual guarantees for that transition? We all want the transition, but we really need to ask, are we just swapping, technologies? Are we swapping materials? But going on with the same underlying economic model, which is premised on more fossil fuel extraction and use, and ultimately on more environmental harm and human rights harm, as an essential premise of the profit making that comes from that fossil fuel based economy. And this is where more and more, basically my work has been trying to understand across many areas of science, but also very much always checking with the lived experiences of those who are experiencing those deep, repeated human rights violations. What are those alliances of economic actors who want to keep us where we are, but just in disguised ways? And so we see how fossil fuels have vertically integrated for many years with the petrochemical industry. In fact, now we have an expansion of fossil fuels, not in our energy systems, where we're making good progress, despite those deep contradictions around the minerals, but we're expanding in our food systems, not only in terms of fossil fuel reliance for very long supply chains, very long transport of ultra processed food. Thank you very much, which is ultra hazardous for all of us and particularly for children. But we're also relying on so much plastics and petrochemicals, which, what do? Not only they create their own emissions, including because of food waste, but they also harm biodiversity, all the carbon sinks, which we also need to protect under this regime, and they cause incredible toxic pollution, to the point that we don't even know of, let's say, 800,000 toxic substances in plastics. We only know, I think, less than, 10,000? What are these substances doing to our lands, who are increasingly, less capable of store carbon or producing food, and less capable of producing nutritious food? What they're doing to our body, where we find plastics and petrochemicals in every single organ of our body, including in the maternal womb. So these are all questions about, this is the price we're all paying for the same complex of large-scale globalized industrial actors who are premised on continued fossil fuel extraction and use. And there's yet another cluster of actors, and this is the military industry complex. They're, of course, premised on using fossil fuels, helping extracting further fossil fuels. The transport of fossil fuels alone, apparently it's a third of how fossil fuels are being used for. So you can see how once you look at all these connections and the insanity of what is happening for allowing the very 1% to keep making billions and trillions at the expense of everyone's health, everyone's secure future, and in fact, more and more our access to food and water. And I think maybe the final chapter in that understanding has been this year, looking at what happened in Venezuela, what happened in Iran, illegal armed interventions, which are both the very last chapter in a playbook of climate disinformation and obstruction, but are also bringing to this absurd situation where we're all seeing so visibly the insecurity that we're all in, every single country in the world, and the even more exorbitant profits for those who are still selling fossil fuels and petrochemicals to all of us, because we're all dependent on that. That said, and with a ray of hope as well, we're seeing this. We're seeing things that we've never seen so clearly before, and we all have to be very much connected with one another to understand how do we respond to this, how do we share this knowledge with those out there who are facing more health impacts, more rising living costs, but may not see their personal struggle as intimately linked to the global climate crisis and the crisis of indigenous peoples, peasants, and the countries who have been most affected by climate change for over a decade. We're all in the same struggle, but we might not be realizing that yet.
Thank you, Elisa, and thank you for making these connections both on how do we do climate action, and do we do it well, do we do it badly, how can it promote peace, how can it actually create, as our economic systems, as the IPCC has identified, are so much a driver in rising temperatures, how do we shift our economic systems, and how do we shift ourselves? Speaking on that, I want to pass on to Sebastian Rodriguez, who is the head of delegation for Colombia here, and also was instrumental in Santa Marta, and that courageous step to ask the questions we need to ask. We have asked Sebastian to speak about the 10 years since the historic peace, the historic peace agreement, and the relationship between climate action, peace building, evolving in a country today. So some of your personal experiences alongside your professional experiences in climate action and peace building. Thank you, Sebastian.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation to this event on a topic that is, of course, of Colombia's interest, being one country that has had one of the longest conflicts in the world. So very happy to share some of the experiences of Colombia with the implementation of the peace agreement after 10 years. One of the key messages for us is that we have learned that climate action in the case of places like Colombia, as well as peace building, are not two separated processes, but have become two dimensions of the same challenges. And although the implementation of the peace agreement has had many challenges, there are also very relevant lessons to share about its implementation. Colombia is, on the one hand, one of the most biodiverse countries in the world, but where also land use change and deforestation remain one of the biggest drivers of CO2 emissions. And at the same time, many of these ecosystems that are key for combating climate change and biodiversity conservation are located in territories historically affected by the armed conflict. And I will come back to this in a moment. For us, climate change is not only an environmental challenge, but it's also a multiplier of the existing vulnerabilities, exacerbating pressures on livelihoods, on increasing inequalities, and aggravating underlying social and territorial tensions. However, what I think is most important or interesting to share is that Colombia's experience has also demonstrated the opposite dynamic. How climate action itself can also become an instrument of peace building. So after the 10 years of the peace agreement, there are some experiences to share that I would like to tell you about, focusing mostly on deforestation. Because I remember that time when we were doing the peace agreement negotiations, people working on environment were wondering how is going to be the impact of this peace agreement on the environment. And we identify some positive drivers and some negative drivers. And the overall result in the case of deforestation was that it was negative. Actually, what happened was that the withdrawal of armed actors created governance vacuums in these areas, where we started to see the expansion of the agricultural frontier, and so practices related to land grabbing, for instance, and speculation for having land tenure rights in these areas, which increased the deforestation in those areas. But this has also taught us an important lesson, that peace agreements alone do not automatically generate environmental benefits, but a lasting peace requires stronger territorial governance and sustainable livelihoods in a meaningful state presence. So one very interesting fact is that in Colombia, we had something called the development programs with territorial focus, and we call that PEDET municipalities. There are municipalities that are identified key for the effective implementation of the peace agreement. If you do an overlap of the map of these PEDET municipalities with deforestation hotspot in Colombia, you find an overlap of almost 1-to-1. And this is, of course, not a coincidence. It both reflect territories that have been historically faced with conflict, exclusion, and weak institutions, and limited development opportunities. So what we have learned is that investing in peace implementation can also become an investment in climate action. So rural development, stronger local institutions, sustainable productive alternatives, land governance, and community partnership help reduce both the drivers of conflict and the drivers of environmental degradations. This has been also integrated in Colombia, for instance, in our NDC, the third version of it, where it has this joint approach for climate and peace in the measures that are going to be implemented, together with an explosion of different projects and governance instruments that have been implemented in Colombia in the last year. So recent years provide encouraging evidence of this relationship. Colombia has achieved one of the most significant reductions in deforestation in its recent history. Between 2022 and 2024, more than 200,000 hectares of forest were preserved, and the preliminary data for 2025 also show promising numbers about this. And this has shown that environmental protection and territorial peace can reinforce one another when communities, institutions, and local actors work together. So I believe that this experience reflects the discussions also that we had in Santa Marta conference to one extent, since a central message emerging from Santa Marta was the transition away from fossil fuels is not simply about replacing one energy source with another. And I think you were also mentioning very important factors of it, that is some of the biggest limitations we have in the UN. People see that even we have a very weak language, when we refer to transition away from fossil fuels, we only have this comma saying on energy systems, and this leaves outside all the petrochemical sector, the plastics, the fertilizers, which are now the biggest driver of the fossil fuel industry. So it is what we learn about in Santa Marta, that is about transforming the economic and social structures similar to the implementation of the peace agreement in this area, thus sustain unsustainable development pathways. And participants in Santa Marta conference repeatedly emphasized that the transition must be people-centered, right-based, and territorially grounded. They highlighted the importance of community participation, social dialogue, just transition plans, and ensuring that the benefits of climate change reach the most vulnerable people. And I want to highlight that this changed completely the dynamic in Santa Marta. For us, it's very difficult to explain our societies why or how it's possible that in the convention that deals with climate change, where fossil fuels are responsible for 75% of the emissions, we are not able to even talk or mention the word fossil fuels. This is very difficult to explain. Science has been clear, and one powerful message coming from Santa Marta, and one of my personal reflections, is we have here in this space the feeling that countries don't want to act. It is impossible to talk about this. It's impossible to cooperate. And what Santa Marta showed us is that countries, like governments, but also private sector, local communities, Afro-descendants, indigenous people, we do want to act, we can collaborate, and we can do things together. So this is a powerful message coming out of Santa Marta. And in many ways, this mirrors Colombia's own experience on implementation of the peace agreement. Just as peace building cannot succeed without addressing the structural conditions that have historically fueled conflict, climate action cannot succeed without addressing the structural conditions that drive environmental degradation. For Colombia, this means understanding that protecting forests, strengthening local governance, supporting rural communities, and implementing the peace agreement are not parallel efforts. They are mutually reinforcing investments in a more resilient, equitable, and sustainable future. Perhaps that is one of the most important lessons we can share after these years of peace building, is that when climate action is rooted in territories and communities, it can become a powerful instrument for building lasting peace. Usually, peace is identified as the absence of conflict, but I think in Colombia we have learned that it also must mean the presence of opportunities, the presence of trust, and the presence of community-grounded action. Thank you.
Sebastian, I don't know where to begin to pull out things that I value, because everything is building up with a real appreciation also for reflecting within Colombia, and then Santa Marta, and the whole focus and the vision that this has given to us here. So thank you so much for bringing that out so eloquently. And I'm moving on now. I'm moving on to Zinta Zommers, who is the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change, IPCC Vice Chair for what is called Working Group 2. Working Group 2 deals with adaptation and vulnerability. Zinta is working on this for the 7th assessment report. I first met her back in 2019 for the land report. She also works for OCHA, so she works in fragile states. We gave Zinta the question, what elements in climate policy or climate action help to contribute to more peaceful and equitable societies? And how could the IPCC reports illustrate these options better? And Zinta, please use that question and move beyond it as you wish. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you very much for having me, and really enjoyed hearing the contributions from other panel members. I'm speaking here today with two hats, as was mentioned. First, with the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, where we really work in fragile and conflict-affected contexts to try to deliver humanitarian aid, both for conflict, but also for climate-related shocks, such as floods and droughts. And the second hat, of course, is the IPCC. And I'll speak to both of these briefly. So first, what elements, to answer the question, what elements are needed to, to kind of build, or what can climate action contribute to peace and equitable societies? And here I'd like to refer to the Central Emergency Response Fund. This is the UN's largest humanitarian fund. And governments provide money to this fund so that emergency response can be taken. And in 2023, there was a new account open, the Climate Action Account, that really focuses on building resilience and well-being through climate action in these humanitarian contexts. And the SURF climate action projects really show that when you talk about what elements, investments in water, in sanitation, in nutrition, education, in agricultural activities can help further well-being. So essentially, as was pointed out by the IPCC, investments in social safety nets can strengthen peaceful and equitable societies, and climate action can be used to invest in these social safety nets. And to give you as an example, the SURF in 2025 funded action in Burundi, released $2.5 million for action in IDP camp, internally and displaced persons, and also refugee camp on the border of DRC. And these were families who had been displaced by conflict and were living in a camp on actually very steep slopes. So there was all sorts of landslide issues with flooding after rainfall. And the activities that were funded included investments in shelter, investments in health, and in water and sanitation. So, for example, improving drainage to reduce flooding, offering gravity-fed water systems, solar power. And what we found was that by reducing pressure on the resources, be it related to water or related to access to energy, we were able to promote peace in terms of inter-community and inter-household relationships. And so in a sense, that kind of climate action could help increase human well-being. OCHA also, through its early warning systems and anticipatory action frameworks, has found similar benefits. The IPCC says that investments in early action that are linked to effective plans can really generate benefits for human well-being and security. And OCHA, since 2020, has invested over $224 million in designing anticipatory action frameworks. These are frameworks that release funding on the basis of a forecast before an event. And actually 40% of our activations of these frameworks or funding has been released in fragile and conflict-affected contexts. And we found that by delivering funding for activities such as reinforcing shelter or for helping farmers protect their crops or plant different seeds in advance of a drought, has benefits resulting in higher food consumption, less predatory lending to households. And actually, we found in South Sudan, again in the context of a conflict, that people used the funding that was released before floods not only to strengthen their shelters to prevent water coming in, but to strengthen their shelters for security by adding locks and helping promote kind of their own safety in these kind of volatile contexts. So that's the OCHA side of what kind of action can we take to help promote well-being and security in these contexts or peaceful coexistence. From the IPCC side, I'd like to say that in our on our report, the AR7 report, one element that we'll hopefully really be strengthening is, you mentioned the point about engagement and in working with communities meaningfully to engage diverse groups to contribute to the report. In February this year, the IPCC had a workshop on how to better include Indigenous and local knowledge in the reports, and the outcome of that discussion was presented here last week. So we're looking to strengthen that kind of engagement. You also mentioned that there are risks from climate action, not just some of the benefits that I've mentioned, but that actually the risks from climate-related responses will be part of this cycle where our risk framework looks not only at how hazards, vulnerability, and exposure influence risks, but also how our responses can be both beneficial and also bring negative results. And the IPCC, there's a specific chapter 20 in Working Group 2, that will be looking at how do we take action, climate action, in fragile and conflict-affected contexts. So an actual chapter will really look at this, and will also look at poverty reduction and migration, so that kind of nexus of all those three areas. Now, the IPCC will be releasing the first draft of its report later this year, and I encourage all of you here today to log on as reviewers, make comments, and particularly remember chapter 20. That's a place where your recommendations and thoughts on this topic can really help shape the report and its conclusions. I'll end there. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Cinta. And I think just having that sense both of the fragile communities and increasingly, at least in the years I've been involved in this work, more and more awareness of how climate action can help in fragile states, but depending on how you do it. And I appreciated those examples, and also the IPCC. Just a small thing, as an IPCC observer ourselves, my organization, at the back are some publications where we put together findings from the 6th assessment report on urgent, fair, equitable, and available at scale climate action. Please take a copy. They're all quotes from the IPCC with everything referenced, so you can use them directly. Our last speaker, Valerian Bernard, is the UN representative for Brahma Kumaris Spiritual University. Valerian is also a key driver of the interfaith coordination, which is done here in the UNFCCC to help bring up those voices. Valerian, we gave you a question. How do you experience the contributions of faith organizations in moving forward peace? And how do you see a role in this UNFCCC process? Thank you, Valerian.
Thank you, and greetings of peace to all my brothers and sisters in the room. The right to peace is a fundamental human right, and it is asserting that every individual in society is entitled to enjoy a life free from war, violence, and fear. I think it is important to recall that. Peace begins within, and no one can and will give anyone else their rights to peace. It is one of the greatest needs and deepest desires people from each continent and religion have in their own world, their own inner world. It's an intrinsic urge and something all humans share. It is something that communities, individuals, and countries need to protect and or recover. Faith organizations provide a spiritual, conceptual, and cultural framework to understand, achieve peace, and connect with the world around us in an harmonious way. As far as climate is concerned, many decisions and measures that should have been taken to protect the people and the environment haven't yet been adopted or applied. This is when climate justice, advocacy, and action are underlining the needs and the measures that should be taken for the well-being of the most affected and for all humanity at large. In climate change, FBOs are important actors. In many instances, they work in disaster relief, in assisting communities to build their resilience. On the ground, they facilitate access to health, food, and support. Being close to the most affected communities, FBOs are aware of their needs in terms of survival, loss and damage, just transition, and we try to bring their voices within the UN and the COPs. FBOs also work in networks, such as the ILC, and we meet during the COPs and all the other UN work. And we bring the need to work on mitigation, adaptation, loss and damage, and finance, and we collaborate to make this happen. While UN agencies such as UNFCCC identify, codify, and coordinate the work that needs to be done globally and locally in relation with implementing needed measures for climate change is still responsible for many inequities, violence, and conditions that prevent people to enjoy their human and spiritual rights. The role of the UNFCCC is to collect everybody's intention to tackle climate change, and the role of the FBOs within it is to empower and share the ethical and moral compass with which all this can hopefully be achieved. In my experience, religions and faith provide a guideline, methodology, a way to reach the experienced peace. And the role of FBOs is also to facilitate this within the communities and give support at a time of hardship, conflict, and crisis. Peace is being in harmony with one another, trust, to be in harmony with oneself and with nature. Spiritual resilience at a time of transition is learning how to cope and deal with harm and trauma. Peace lies within us, and the more peaceful someone is, the more he or she will bring the influence of positivity in his surroundings, people, family, and with nature. And I'd like to tell you a small story to illustrate this. It is the story of yogic farmers. At a time when so many Indian farmers were committing suicide because of the imposed changes in agriculture, where only seeds that were not fertile were accessible, and contrary to the traditional agriculture, it wouldn't be possible to keep the seeds, to sow them for the next harvest. These new seeds had to be bought and fertilized by chemical products. In a way, it is a form of colonization, and it is a disharmonious imposition on earth and people. In this context, the yogic farmers decided to apply their spirituality to their work, thereby creating a positive relationship with both the land and the seeds. By respecting it, loving it, and cultivating it in a natural way, many of the farmers were coming from a story of chemical fertilizers having completely burnt their land, and how therefore they decided and reverted to a natural way, a peaceful way to cultivate their land with gratitude, understanding that cultivating their lands was mirroring the cultivating they were doing in their own minds and in their own lives. Of course, the food produced this way is a lot healthier for the farmers' families, the customers, but even for Earth itself. And this has now become a project that's involving several local governments in India. And it is, I think, thousands of farmers, and it is fighting the desertification that was taken over in India. Thank you.
Thank you, Valerian, and I think of the ethical and moral compass that you raise, but also the example of what happens with our economic system, for example, the terminator seeds. What does that do to people? And then you have farmers committing suicide, that wake-up call. So I want to just ask you to quickly turn to each other, and then we're going to ask you to bring back from here what you want to share. There are two questions. There are two questions that we put together. Building on what you have held and what you have heard, how can climate action advance peace, human well-being, and safety? And what sense of hope and peace can you reflect and can I reflect in my climate action advocacy? I just want you to quickly turn to someone and give one example, and then I'm grateful to just raise your hand and share something that may have touched you, that you want to reflect on, and use this last 20 minutes. Just a brief hello to your neighbor. Hello everybody, I'm going to bring you back again. And I'm going to repeat the question, and then I'm going to say, please share. These were the questions. Building on what we have heard, how can climate action... Hello. How can climate action advance peace, human well-being, and safety? And what sense of hope and peace can I reflect in my climate action advocacy? Let's hear your thoughts. Please share.
Thank you. I'm Haendel from Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, and it's actually the oldest women's peace organization in the world. Right, that's what I want to talk about. I want to give you an example from Batir, which is a small village that I visited in the West Bank, in the occupied Palestinian territories. It's a UNESCO World Heritage. They are planting on terraces, and well, UNESCO tries to protect them. And there are women, just a few women in the village, that have a small room where they keep seeds of eggplants, and I could eat these traditional vegetables there. They are trying to keep up the seeds, the traditional seeds, the traditional food, and by that they are trying to keep up, it's our land, it's our identity, while the Israeli settlers are getting closer and putting up outposts and endangering this village. But they are keeping up the spirit by planting eggplants.
Thank you, Will. Yes, at the back.
Can people help me in the back?
I'm Vincent, coming from Rome, from a Catholic NGO. I'm working for justice, peace, and integrative creation. This discussion has been very, very interesting. In the topic itself, we see climate change, which is connected to ecology and nature, and human well-being. Coining these two, ecology and human well-being, Pope Francis has coined a new word, that is integral ecology. That means every person and every form of life are connected. Even if one aspect is not connected, there will not be development. In 1967 itself, Pope Paul VI, he issued an encyclical Populorum Progresso, that means human development. in which he says, peace is another word for development. If you say peace means it is development. If you say development, it is peace. Therefore, if there has to be peace in the world, there has to be development and integral human development. And integral ecology, that means all forms of life and all persons could be developed. That's why climate change and human well-being are connected. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Another voice.
I can probably talk quite loudly, but actually the lady is not here, isn't her, at the moment. So actually one thing I took away, I came in here thinking, oh, nothing is working, and you know, all the dreadful numbers on military spending and so forth. But I did take away that there is a lot happening to help people in Somalia and other places. Money is going there from the rich community. It's not enough, but I didn't know that things were actually being done on the mitigation element. Yes, but I'm taking a bit of positivity away from this.
Thank you. And in that, when we talk about how do you do it well, and rights-based approaches and human rights-based approaches and participation and community, as Sebastian was talking about, those examples are so powerful and they're there and we need to highlight them. Thank you.
See, anyone who hasn't spoken who'd like to share? You are experts too. We want to hear from you. Yes.
Hello, I would like to share that I think what happens in these spaces is often that we don't really talk about a human in the climate action. And maybe we often forget about the persons that are also participating in the defense of the climate and the environment, and the human rights defenders that are participating or activists and that have been threatened by their governments, and we don't really put attention in those movements that are happening, in every country. And putting environmental justice that don't consider human rights, it's like a contradictory position, because without the precondition of human rights and the possibility to participate, to collaborate, and to exercise the right to defend human rights, especially the environmental rights, we can really think about a climate action that has a positive effect on communities. And also I think that we are thinking about the climate action from top to the bottom, not from bottom to the top. The main responses that happen in the climate action are in the communities. It isn't really that we have to make a transition, but to listen and pay attention in those proposals that are happening every day, not that are spontaneous or that are from the future, but are given from the ancestral conscience and also from the participation, collaboration in the community spaces. That's my approach. Thank you. Oh, and also there must be also a theology for the resistance. That is a new concept that is appearing in the spirituality. That all the actions that happen in the spirituality must also translate into an active action in order to achieve justice, in this case, environmental justice. Thank you.
Thank you. That's very strong and powerful. Thank you for that. Another voice.
Speak Spanish. Gracias.
No, eres nativa.
It's okay, we don't translate.
Buenas tardes. Bueno, mi nombre es Leocadia, me dicen Leo o Leo. Yo soy de Costa Rica. Quise tomar un minuto para hablar de algo porque creo que todas las personas que están ahí y muchas de las que están aquí tienen la idea de apoyar y de ayudar lo más que se pueda en todo lo que tiene que ver con defensa, ¿cierto? Yo soy defensora, yo estoy en la batalla, en el campo de batalla. Y es cierto que lo que defendemos todos lo hacemos porque amamos. No porque somos valientes, sino porque amamos lo que creemos que hay que defender, el bosque, los lugares donde nosotros nacimos, todo lo que hay de la flora y la fauna en general, porque con eso defendemos el planeta, que es quien nos abriga, y el planeta o la naturaleza no nos necesita a nosotros, somos nosotros a ellos. Entonces, un detalle que lo que debemos tener primero es conciencia para después actuar. Y es lo que no hay en el mundo, no es solo en mi país, no en el país de cada uno de ustedes, en el mundo. Entonces, yo como defensora me veo...
So she's Leo, she's from Costa Rica, and she's an environmental defender. And she was saying that one of the main reasons why environmental defenders, but most probably all the people who are here, that we commit into the defense of the environment is firstly because we love nature. And she made a very important emphasis saying that we are the ones who depend on nature and on Mother Earth, and not them and Mother Earth who depends on us. So, yeah.
There's a law behind
Entonces, el trabajo que hacemos nosotros es bastante peligroso porque estamos poniendo a nuestro cuerpo, nuestra familia en peligro por defender. Yo soy una de las que he tenido que salir del lugar donde vivo por amenazas. Entonces, lo que quería es más que todo explicar que es un trabajo que hacemos. No nos vamos a rendir porque nos hayan amenazado, pero necesitamos sentirnos no solamente que hay convenios, que hay leyes que nos protegen, sino que se cumplan esos convenios, esas leyes, y que nosotros sintamos esa seguridad para poder seguir trabajando tranquilo y en paz y sentirnos seguros.
So something that she said before that I missed, she was also saying that one of the most important things is to teach on the conscious about our relationship to nature. And then she was also sharing a story that the work that she is doing and other defenders are doing creates a lot of threat, not only for her, but for her family. So she was stressing the need that indeed environmental defenders and local communities do need laws, do need international treaties, but most importantly, they need that these treaties work, yes, and that they actually protect them so that they can continue doing their work in the ground and with the communities and with nature.
And safe.
And safely.
I see Lucy, but I just want to honor what you have said and the work we do and must continue to do to protect those with the courage to stand.
I understood.
Okay, Lucy, and then first Lucy at the back and then our friend here.
Thank you so much. Hi everyone, I'm Lucy. I work on youth engagement for Soka Gakkai International. I think I just am inspired to share maybe a reflection of this experience for me at the SB64. I think what has been quite hopeful is I can really feel and hear a shift of very implementation-oriented discussions happening. Like people are really starting to think about, focusing on implementation, which is great. But from kind of a civil society perspective, what's really clear is that civil society, the language of like beneficiaries is still very much ingrained, like in kind of the party side. So seeing civil society actors as beneficiaries of policy other than like partners and actors. And just giving a concrete example, I've been following ACE, the Action for Climate Empowerment, which for me it's very much like it is a people-centered, but for me it's very much like an opportunity for those on the ground to really get involved in implementation. But what's so disappointing to see is that the discussions are still focused on like what parties can do to implement, which it's all about finance, which I completely understand that's very important, but civil society is a huge resource for implementing like ACE, and should be like, that's the whole point of it in my opinion, is to really empower like youth and many other groups. So I feel that seeing just people as beneficiaries of policy is, we need to transform that way of thinking and see people as real agents of change. And that I'm not seeing reflected in the discussions right now.
Thank you, Lucy. That's really powerful. And that's raised the voice. Thank you. And this will be our last. And then I'd like to just quickly ask for one sentence of hope from each of our panelists before we go.
Okay, hi. I'm Stephanie. I'm from Germany. I'm a climate, human rights, environmental activist, and I have different feelings, mixed feelings about the meaning of climate action. As far as I understood from this panel, climate action at the moment, the most effective climate action comes from the communities and the indigenous people, as well everywhere, as well as in Germany, for example. We have like energy corporations building renewable energies in their communities and trying to push renewable energies here. And I'm very, very thankful for the words, I forgot your name, sorry, in Spanish, but the connection to nature is the biggest problem we have, because most of us lost it. And I hope we get some last sentences of hope, because I have not much hope anymore, and I still feel the responsibility and necessity to go into action and to do civil disobedience, even if the repressions in Germany are rising as well, not to be compared with the risks that other activists all over the world take. But yes, I think the major point is to limit global warming. Every inch, every little comma, grade after the comma, counts. And for me, it's not for human civilization. For me, it's for all the wonderful coexistences in this world.
Thank you for sharing your grief as well. Thank you. I'll start with Valerian and come down.
Transforming the way we think with peace and courage, and there is hope.
Yeah, just to say thank you everybody for sharing. It's been inspiring to hear from all of you. I think that's where I get hope, is by sometimes attending these type of events and conferences can be depressing, but meeting the people here who are each trying in their own lives to make a difference is what inspires me. And just again, from the IPCC side, we know there are things that we can do on the ground that do have positive impacts. So the solutions are there. And it's just a matter of, as you were saying, getting to the implementation and really getting to that work. So hopefully that can provide some hope.
Thank you. Yes, I think there is hope. Both of the examples that I touched upon. Yeah. Yeah. Both examples that I touched upon, I think, also examples from Colombia showing that climate action could have the role of contributing not only for these environmental objectives, but also for peace building and contributing also the communities and people living on the ground. I think it gives hope also the results that we have had in the last years, but also on the second topic that I talk about on the Santa Marta conference, I think that also demonstrated that what we were missing was a space to come together and to talk and dialogue and cooperate, and that sometimes being locked in the negotiations in these big buildings of the United Nations gave us this sense of inaction and powerless. But once we have a space where people can go together and you can give a voice to all stakeholders and all people interested in this, I think there is no doubt a hope that we can work together to mobilize our joint efforts. Thank you.
I would like to share some stories I've heard in preparing the food systems report that really gave me a lot of hope, also as a European and maybe somebody who hasn't had in recent history that connection with nature that other people have. And it's just how quickly we can reestablish really meaningful connections with nature, even in urban environments, and what that means for our solidarity and hope, and how we construct ways to, that are both climate just and peaceful. So there's quite a lot of resurgence now, like community gardens, urban food systems, and what they mean, both people having that connection with the land that they wouldn't normally have in urban sites, but also what that means in terms of them healing. And this is something coming from the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to health. She says how whenever we reconnect with nature, there's both collective and individual healing and intergenerational alliances. And I think it just all of that comes really organically, and that can also be a really powerful kind of bottom up, where we can learn from indigenous peoples and other environmental defenders, but we can also nourish that in our own contexts. And at the end of the day, I mean, transformative change does say that change comes from the ground, and it's really just drawing and finding different ways to be connected and do the work ourselves. And in fact, I made a note about how I think peace and climate justice are a matter of scale, smaller scale than the big scale we think will bring. And that's one of the problems in our economic system. We assume large scale will deliver. It does not. It feeds into these really powerful economic interests that got us here, and the connections. And so something I've heard in ICAD, which is another conference that Colombia and their international leadership organized this year, was the second after 20 years conference on agrarian reform, and it was all about all the social movements to protect land. And they were saying we need to globalize the struggle, that's I was referring to struggle earlier, to globalize hope. So it's all about that, reconnecting with nature wherever we can, with whoever we can, and see what flourishes there. But something will flourish very powerfully and very healing.
Thank you. And just briefly, Flore?
Yes, just to say that indeed today in our society we're living in a culture of war, and the question is how do we shift to a culture of peace? The good news is that we have the keys, because this starts in our own heart. So the question is really how on a daily basis we do root in our heart a culture of peace, so that then it can spread towards larger layer of the society.
And thank you all. They're standing at the back because we're over time, the pressure is on, but thank you for coming, thank you for sharing, and build that light and shine your light. Thank you so much.